that wasn't against the law back in. So we're really limited to what we could actually do at these times. So as I said before, violence for me is everything from verbal, emotional, physical, and sexual. And it's not about, and I often look at violence on a continuum, starting with verbal violence, going to emotional, to physical, to sexual. And not every form of abuse will move along that continuum from verbal to sexual violence. I'm not saying that sexual violence is more serious than verbal abuse, or less, or emotional abuse is less serious than sexual abuse or whatever. You know, I'm saying that because often violence, homicides start with something. Stabbing start with something. Physical assaults start with the rumours and the gossiping. And for me as a trainer, bringing bystanders into the conversation, I want people to intervening as early as possible to start to spot the language, the jokes. There was a few weeks ago, there was a boxer was, I think, complained about for posting a film of, I think it was his girlfriend or wife tied up under the stairs. You know, lockdown's just started, and it was a joke. But what does that say? You know, that we often joke about these situations when it comes to domestic abuse. So I think for me, it's about getting to think about, yeah, it's a serious problem. You know, some of the other, let me just move this on if I can. My things, here we go. So this is some of the key stats for domestic abuse. You know, around 60,000 incidents, 81% of these incidents that I'm aware of that are reported, and I know that these are reported cases, involve female victims and male perpetrators. And I'm not wanting to exclude male victims. We're seeing a lot more. I'm glad we're seeing a lot more conversation about male victims of domestic abuse. It's big. It needs to be talked about. As I say, we need a gender inclusive understanding of the problem, but not always a gender neutral response to these issues. So 81% female victims, male perpetrators. I think 1 in 3 women will be a victim of some men's violence at some stage in their life. 1 in 6, 1 in 7 men victims of domestic abuse. Often in the hands of other men, you know, within LGBT relationships as well. Greatest demand on Police Scotland, 20% of their time. 9% of all domestic abuse involves sexual violence. You know, murders in Scotland, 40% are related to domestic, grossly underreported. And someone talked about in the home, the vast majority take place in the home, with other places, but with the advent of technology, you know, you can be abused at work, you can be abused on the way to work, on your night out with your friends. And every 9 minutes, the police in Scotland respond to a domestic abuse call. So what is domestic abuse? And this, it's funny, this definition was a Scottish government definition, I believe, from 2000. You know, domestic abuse as gender-based abuse, can be perpetrated by partners or ex-partners, and can include physical abuse, sexual abuse, and mental and emotional abuse. So even back in 2000, the definition of domestic abuse included a whole range of behaviours, but the police couldn't always respond to everything that's in that definition. What do I mean by gender-based abuse? What's your thoughts on this? This is where there's pushback against this definition, but what's your understanding of gender-based abuse? Anybody? I'm trying to find the chat room. Any thoughts on gender-based? Yeah, 5809, that's 2019. I average it out about 60,000 cases every year. But what do you mean by gender-based abuse? Any thoughts? I think from my understanding and reading is that we look at domestic abuse through our lens of gender, which talks about how in the bulk of cases that we see, it's women's experience at the hands of some men. That's what we're talking about, applying a gender-based, and it's also within the context of a patriarchal system that we often see in this world, power and dynamics at play. So that's the definition we have of domestic abuse. And really, as I say, back then, the police couldn't respond to all this stuff. It had to be a crime. It had to be a common law crime. It had to be against a statute, a piece of legislation. That all changed in a couple of years ago. I'm just getting my screen to move forward. Hang on. Here we go. So calls that the Police Scotland receive. What types of incidents do you think would police be attending to if they were attending a domestic abuse call, what types of incidents do you think the police would be attending that might be badged as domestic abuse? What's your thoughts? What types of calls would we be seeing? You know, that would come to our as part of a domestic abuse. Any thoughts from anybody here? Assault, so criminal acts itself, violence, yeah, physical violence. Could be disputes over children. It could be noise complaints, raised voices, shouting home, entrapment, noise from neighbours. Yeah. How are incidents normally reported? Who would report a domestic abuse incident? Do you think alcohol? Yeah. Who would actually report a domestic abuse incident? Neighbours. Yeah. Good. So neighbours, the victims themselves. Who else might report a domestic abuse incident? If we have neighbours, if we have victims, children, but who else might report it? Family, friends. So the victims themselves, but who else might report a domestic abuse call? Family. What about the perpetrator? School staff, definitely. We're seeing a lot of, there's some really good perpetrator, definitely a lot of that's an important thing. And we often saw that just to try and maintain some control of what was going on. So these are sort of things that we're working, getting Police Scotland to really think about. So assaults, damage to property, verbal argument, stalking, harassment, coercive control. We wouldn't normally get that. We wouldn't really get calls around that, and calls being made by the victim and by the perpetrator, medical staff, friends, etc. And one thing that a lot of the academia around domestic abuse is split domestic abuse into these three categories, and I'll go through these three categories just now, and they're all quite distinct, but these are the types of situations, I suppose, that police do respond to in many situations. We talked about situational couple violence. People argue. Husbands, wives, boyfriends, girlfriends, boyfriends. People argue in relationships, and that can get heated, but that's often, some of this stuff there, it's someone's just lost it. They've got angry, and they have just, that it's resulted in something happening within that relationship. But often the motivation is not about control. It's more likely to be instinctive and reactive to a stimuli. We talk about alcohol, we talk about football. Alcohol and football, they're not causes of domestic abuse. They're contributing factors. They don't, perpetrators cause abuse. Football and alcohol can be a factor. But that believed not to be gendered, that basically means that this both anybody can suffer this. This is more or less equal, and can escalate. It can be fatal at times. Such people just falling out and arguing. This next one, which is really what the legislation that I'm going to talk about shortly introduced, this idea of coercive control and behaviour, where offenders have very rigid belief systems and expectations in a relationship. There's a power dynamic. They're aware of what they're doing. They're not losing it. If something's happening, I remember going to calls where bruises were under the clothing. They were at points of the body that you wouldn't routinely see it unless the person was wearing a t-shirt, and that suggests to me a bit of control, a bit of awareness that people are not going to see this. But the last bit, the people, because they feel justified, they feel it's okay, it's their right to behave in that type of way. We talk about healthy and toxic relationships. In healthy relationships, we're getting on with each other. We're all cooperating, mutual agreement. It's consistent with agreements, flexible. There's, if I forget to put the bins out on Monday night, I'm not going to get a tank in on Tuesday. It's a mistake. It happens. That's a safe relationship. We make mistakes. In a coercive, controlling relationship, it's demanded to, and the victim sticks to it for fear that something's going to happen. It's inconsistent. We all need consistency in our relationships. When we don't have consistency in our relationships, we don't feel safe. Constantly changing demands and punishment for non-compliance, for not having the dinner ready, for not having the house cleaned, for not having for the kids making a noise, the dogs barking, something's going to happen to that individual. And coercive control, we often think, that this goes back to this continuum idea. Does coercive control just happen? We talk about a journey, and try and remember your first relationships. My dogs are barking in the background there. Your early intimate relationships. What happens in these relationships? You often forget your friends, you forget your family. You're so immersed in their relationship, and often that can be the start. Not all, in most cases, not the case, but that can be the start of the grooming stage where the victim has been charmed and the abuser's getting to know everything about them. It's the start of the isolation. My friend in America, Leslie Morgan Steiner, has done a really good TED talk called Crazy Love. Well worth a watch. Crazy Love, Leslie Morgan Steiner, and she talks about the early stages. This charming man, this loving man who wanted to know everything about me, who wanted to be there. But it was just, it went through all of these stages here. We talk about managing the situation where things are happening. The victim adapts their behavior. It's me. It's not him or her. It's me. Things are happening. Victim blaming. We know that victims blame themselves for what happens to them, and then we'll talk about victim blaming later on. But society blames them as well. But one of the greatest things that any one of us can say to a friend, work colleague, family member, if we suspect they're a victim of domestic abuse, or they tell us they are, is that wasn't your fault. You didn't deserve that. And get that in your toolkit from the first 2 or 3 sentences. It's such a powerful thing to say to any victim. And this is the journey that a victim will go on of coercive control. Defining the abuse. We all have a role. If we have trained dentists in the past to spot injuries in the face, and we would train them to say, I've seen this in your face. I think something's happened to you. That wasn't your fault. And there was a bit of research came out a couple of years ago which said that if you see a female with a bruise on her face, it's 32 times more likely to have been caused by domestic abuse than anything else. And the challenge for you is it won't always be domestic abuse. But how are you going to find out? You have to think about ways of approaching that. So it's about, and we can all help victims define abuse, because we have a lot of people living in abusive relationships who don't define the behavior as abusive. That's what happens. So we have a role in helping our friends, our family members, our work colleagues identify what's going on. And when we start to help a victim define the abuse, then they can start to reevaluate. They see the support, they see empathy from friends and people around them. We know that when a victim decides to leave a coercive controlling relationship, big risk go up. And so that's why we, it annoys me. We still have people who say, well, why don't they just leave the relationship? Many would love to leave the relationship, but they've got the home and they've got the money, they've got the pet dog, they've got the kids. Whilst safety might be a short-term gain, long-term, it's not always going to be the case. So this is the journey that we take police officers now to give them a better understanding of coercive control, so that at any time that you get a call from a family member or from a doctor or school or whatever, we want them to be asking, how are you feeling? How are you feeling in this relationship? And dropping in, that's not your fault, at any opportunity. So coercive control is one of these things we really need to be, and Evan Stark, he's a Canadian doctor, expert, academic on domestic abuse, talks about intimate terrorism. This can be like walking in the eggshells, just not knowing the inconsistency. If I walk forward, what's going to happen to me? It's terrifying for victims. I mean, some of the national soaps have been covering some really good storylines looking at domestic violence with a coercive controlling story, really good. And the last one, violent resistors, and you might be aware of the Sally Challen case. This was last year. She was released from prison. And this is where a person undergoing, and quickly going back to coercive control, this is usually gendered. The vast majority of cases usually involve female victims and male perpetrators. Not all the time, but the vast majority of cases. So violent resistance is where the victim is just being controlled, and they blow up. They just blow up and retaliate. When Sally was convicted for murder many years ago, I think she had stabbed her husband 37 times. So it's like she just completely lost it. And that I think she was released from jail the back end of last year, and there's no retrial. So there's some good recognition around the impact of coercive control. So that's the 3 types of abuse that can take place. And just to sort of summarize that part, situational couple violence people argue all the time. Situation-based, something's happened, alcohol might be involved, there's no control, the perpetrator will feel immediate remorse. I didn't mean to do that. I'm so sorry. But it can lead from minor violence to be fatal. Coercive control, that's that's the danger one. That's why the police are now, and I'll talk about legislation after this, that's why we've got the new law in, which really brings into play the whole definition of domestic abuse. And violent resistance is the sort of blow up, self-preservation. It's not about seeking power. I can't cope with this, and they just lose that state of mind at that particular time. So as I said, the law has changed in the last couple of years. We have the new Domestic Abuse Scotland Act, which came into play last year. It was 2018, but enacted last year. Talks about abusive behaviour towards a partner or ex-partner. Unlike England and Wales, where domestic abuse can include family members, domestic abuse in Scotland is based on partners in intimate relationships. So a person commits an offence if they engage in a course of behaviour involving behaviour on at least 2 occasions, which is abusive of the partner or ex-partner. And this course of this 2 occasions and the behaviour, it's anything. We've had cases in Scots courts forcing a person to clean her teeth, withholding money. But the police need to be able to prove this, to be able to put it to the courts. Cases of assault, stalking are still there in legislation, so they'll be dealt with as separate offences. But this is to deal with these controlling behaviours. The reasonable person test is we don't have to have harm. There doesn't have to be physical harm or harm seen on the person. It's just, would a reasonable person consider that the behaviour used by the perpetrator was likely to cause physical or psychological harm? So it's a really good bit of offence. You know, abusive behaviour towards an ex-partner. These are the key words. You know, abusive behaviour is, you know, looking at the bullet points down there, making a person dependent on the perpetrator, isolating a person from friends, relatives, controlling, regulating, or monitoring their activity. So you can see the extent of this offence. This offence can be committed out with Scotland as well. So if you're, say for example, your primary residence is in Scotland, but you're on holiday, or you are a member of the armed forces stationed abroad, it can be committed. The police can join all these situations up. So really, and also behaviour to what a child, you know, where a child is used and child is present when this is happening, it's not an additional offence, it's an aggravated offence, which I think is a game changer that we have in Scotland. We can actually, if a child is present, we're actually recognising the impact now of domestic abuse on children. You know, it's wonderful that we have laws that are starting to do that now. We're impacting the impact of domestic abuse on young children and how domestic abuse can actually be damaging for the long term on that individual. And just to sort of conclude, and we'll get some questions going shortly. You know, Scotland, your country needs you. This is a blog that I wrote a few months ago. I said before, I think, you know, we need systems. We need the law. We need swift, visible justice. That's clear. We need support for victims. We need organisations, National Women's Aid, local women's aid organisations, Abused Men in Scotland, doing great work to deal with male victims, looking at LGBT as well. We need organisations. It's important that we have this systemic support for victims. But what about you? What's your role? I said at the start, do the knowledge, learn about this stuff. When you start to learn about domestic abuse, you make the invisible visible. Often, a lot of coercive control is in plain sight. It's invisible in plain sight. It's there. You know, someone's at work receiving text messages, being upset after the text message, or constantly on the phone, being upset. Learn to spot the red flags and learn to ask. You know, survivors of domestic abuse, actually, I remember working with survivors in America, and in this country, they actually want people to say something. That's why we train hairdressers and vets and dentists to spot injuries in the face, but also injuries in pets, because we know pet abuse is often used to control a victim. So we really started to bring that in during my time at the VIU. So learn to spot these red flags, do the knowledge. Stop blaming victims. I'm not having a go at you, I'm having a go at society. Society still does that. We blame victims, we don't blame themselves, and we do it as well. It's a double whammy for victims. It's a victim's choice to leave a relationship. We shouldn't be pressurizing. All we need to say to a victim who discloses, or we think they're a victim, this isn't your fault. What do you want to do? I believe you. That's it. it's about then ferrying them on to support agencies, Women's Aid, Rape Crisis, Abuse Men in Scotland, getting them the support to allow them to go through the final stages of leaving their relationship. Because leaving a relationship is a journey for a victim, something they just can't do overnight. It's a journey for them, and they have to do it at the right times to reduce the risk to them as well. Talk about the issue in your circle of friends and your family. If you're on Twitter, social media, share, because when you talk about the issue, you become an ally. When you talk about any issue in the world, whether it be racism, sexual violence, sexism, homophobia, whatever that's going to be, if you talk about it passionately, you become an ally. And people will come and speak to you. But you'll also send out a message to some people that perpetrate abuse that their behaviour is not going to be tolerated. And we need more of that in society. And that last one there, as men speak up, I do see violence as a man's issue. And some people disagree with that, and that's okay. But, violence is very personal to me, not just in my professional life. I've talked about my girls' experiences. I lost my dad to suicide in 2008. Violence is very personal. And I think we will, it's a bit like racism. We need white people to speak up about racism. When it comes to violence, we need more men to show the courage, the moral courage to speak out and set the tone for the next generation of our boys need good guideposts. So speak up about it, set the tone, challenge safely. We don't have to challenge our friends' sexist behaviour or homophobic behaviour. We don't have to be all vocal and all calling them out. Make a connection. Hey, I'm your mate. I care about you, but that's not right. What's going on? That's not you. Find a way to bring them in the conversation. There's a American educationalist, Esther Sola, a few years ago said that we need to invite men into the conversation because men feel indicted. And I use that phrase a lot. We need to invite people into a conversation. Women as well, and anybody, invite them into a conversation. And that was based on a bit of research done a few years ago, which said that men often felt pointed at when it comes to domestic abuse. And I've been there. That first day in the police service, I sat in a lecture from a local Women's Aid organisation, and I came out thinking, I'm the problem. And it stuck with me for the best part of 15, 20 years until I met Jackson Katz, who says, you're the solution. He just flipped the narrative. So we need to invite men into the conversation. Don't force them in, invite them in.